Chapter 4 A Summer Challenge. Crash. Whoops! Galyal sat up in bed and rubbed her eyes. Natasha rolled over, grabbed her pillow, and hugged it tighter. Galyal climbed out of bed, pulled the door open, and looked both ways. Carefully, she stepped into the hallway. Hello? Dobre utre, she called. Up here, Mila called from the top of the attic stairs. Galyal climbed up and found Mila stacking textbooks next to a torn box. So that's what crashed, Galyal said. Sorry to wake you, Mila said. Materials Engineering. Galyal read the title on the textbook on top of the pile. Are these your books from university? They are, Mila said. I have more in my office at work, if you can believe that. What do material engineers do anyway? Natasha appeared at the top of the attic stairs, rubbing sleep out of her eyes. Good morning, Natasha, Mila smiled brightly. Give us a hand and I'll tell you about it. Natasha sat on the floor next to them and began stacking books. Engineers are people who use what they know about science and math and their creativity to solve problems. Materials engineers work on problems that are related to materials, like investigating the properties of materials or figuring out how to make new materials with new properties. Materials like plastic and metal, Natasha asked. Sure, Mila said, but lots of other materials too. This summer, I'm going to help your mama by taking a look at some of the petroglyphs she's studying. I can use my materials engineering knowledge to help think of ways to preserve the materials, the rocks, into which they are carved. Why would engineers want to preserve old stuff? Natasha asked. Well, just like people can use and learn from new technologies, we can learn from ancient technologies too. I thought technologies were always new things, Galyal said. How can a technology be ancient? A technology is anything, system, or process people design to help solve problems. So computers and cell phones are modern technologies. But ancient technologies like baskets and spears help solve problems too. Materials engineers work with all kinds of materials, from brand new plastics and metals to materials like wood and rock that have existed for thousands of years. Take a look around. What materials do you see? The girls surveyed the attic. The books are made from paper, Galyal said. That coat rack is made from wood, and that, whatever it is, looks like it's made from a caiman, a rock. She pointed to a small square object on the edge of one of the piles. The rock was green and white, the colors running like ribbons across the surface. The white parts seemed to sparkle in the sun. That's really pretty, Natasha said. She picked it up and traced the surface with her finger. What is it? It's actually a model of something you two know quite well. See? She took it from Natasha and flipped it over, revealing a carving of a deer. It's a petroglyph, Galyal said. Well, actually, it's a petroglyph replica, a copy, Mila said. Good guess about it being made from rock, but it's actually plastic that was made to look like rock. The vendors sell them near the caves of Lake Onago, so visitors can remember their trip. But like I said, it's not real. That's why I have it in the giveaway pile. Are you sure you want to give it away? Natasha asked. Look how shiny it is. She rubbed her hand over the graceful carved lines. Hey, you don't even like petroglyphs, Galyal said. You said petroglyphs are boring. You know, Mila said, we could. Did not, Natasha interrupted. Anyway, this one's special. It looks like a kamushki I have in my jewelry, not the boring gray cave walls where Mama studies her petroglyphs. Right, Mila began again. How about... But I saw it first, Galyal protested. But you just want to add it to your rock collection, Natasha said. I would make something useful. You know what I think we should do? Mila said forcefully. The girls looked at her, momentarily shamed. Mila smiled. I think you should try to make your own petroglyphs, she said. One's actually made out of rocks, so they'd be more accurate replicas of real petroglyphs. What do you say? The girls looked at Mila, then back at each other. Maybe, Natasha said. We'd probably have to do research to be sure what kind of rock would work best, right, Mila? Galyal said. Go to the library or look it up online? Yes, that's one way to figure it out, Mila said. Natasha rolled her eyes. Or we could just go outside and look at the rocks ourselves, she said. You can't learn everything from a book, Galyal. Well, you can't learn everything just from walking around and looking either, Galyal said. Okay, Mila said. I see where this is going, and you're both right. Materials engineers use all sorts of resources when they're trying to learn about properties of a material or to create a new material. Sometimes we use books, sometimes we run tests, and sometimes we can learn about one material by comparing it to another. So, you're saying I'm right. If we want to make our own petroglyphs, we can go outside and look for the right kind of rock, Natasha said. And I'm right too, Galyal said quickly, because it'll help to read about the rocks so we can make good choices. Mila looked from one twin to the other and sighed. Well, I guess yes, she said. But my main point is that if you think about this like materials engineers, you can use both ways. No matter what you do, you need to focus on the right properties to make progress. I know what some properties of rocks are, Galyal said, like the texture or the color of the rock, or how hard it is, Natasha added. Right, Mila said. Materials have different properties that make them good choices for some uses and not as good for others. Why don't you each gather information the way you want to? Then we can talk about what you've learned. Mila stood up and brushed her hands on her pants. This will be your materials engineering challenge for this summer, figuring out what kind of rock would be best for making your own petroglyphs. Chapter 5. Galyal's Questions. Galyal walked into the library and breathed deeply. She wandered a while through the shelves until she finally rounded the corner into the section she wanted. She ran her finger along the row of books as she read each title, then pulled out a book called The Geology of Galyal. With so many petroglyphs around here, there must be a lot of rocks in Galyal that would work, she thought. She sat down and flipped to the first chapter, How Rocks Form. Galyal read about the rock cycle, the processes that form the 3 different types of rocks. She read about igneous rocks forming from cooling of hot liquid magma. She read about sedimentary rocks forming from pieces of other rocks that travel through rivers and streams and settle in the bodies of water that compress them. She read about how both of those types of rocks change into metamorphic rocks by being pushed and melted and kneaded like bread dough as the earth moves. And she read how the steps of the rock cycle don't always happen in the same order. Any rock type can be changed into another rock type depending on the processes it goes through. Galyal paused in her reading and looked out the window at a nearby hill. She imagined the hill as it could have been thousands of years ago, a volcano spewing hot lava, throwing bits of the liquid into the air, those little bits hardening quickly as they fell. And she imagined a river of lava flowing down the mountain, hardening slowly as it blanketed plants and other rocks in its path. Galyal set down the book and pulled out another, a pocket guide to identifying rocks. She scanned the table of contents and flipped to the last section. Across 2 full pages were questions, set up like a game board. Depending on how you answered the questions, you were directed to another question, and then another. This should be easy enough, Galyal murmured. How big are the grains of rock you see in your or how big are the grains you see in your rock? She thought for a moment. Were there grains in the real petroglyph Mama has shown me? I don't remember. She stared out the window again and sighed. Oh, the worst thing possible had happened, and she hated to admit it. Natasha had been right. Sometimes you just couldn't beat observing. Chapter 6. Natasha's Questions. At the beach on the other side of town, Natasha knelt in the sand and rocks and set down the bucket she'd brought with her. She was always amazed at how many different rocks she could find in just one section of the beach. She picked up a cream-colored stone with an orange line crossing through its center. It was almost perfectly round, except for a little knob poking out of one side. That's where I'll put a hole for string, Natasha thought, imagining it hanging from a necklace. She rubbed the stone between her fingers. Years of tumbling in the sand and water had smoothed it. She had a rock tumbler at home that did the same thing. It just worked more quickly. Natasha eyed the stone again. This might be good for a necklace, she thought, but no way would it work for a petroglyph. No place to carve a picture. She slipped the stone in her pocket and considered other rocks scattered around her. A flat-sided rock caught her eye. Now, this one might work. She could almost see the design etched into the side. One by one, she placed rocks in the bucket or in her pockets. Some were colorful and good for jewelry. Others were gray like the ones in Mama's petroglyph sites. Some were sharp and others smooth. Soon her bucket was heavy. As she started to leave, an unusual stone caught her eye. It was brown, gray, and red, and looked like 3 rocks had somehow mushed together. This is an odd one, she murmured. I wonder where this came from. Not pretty enough for jewelry, too small and rough for a petroglyph, but still neat enough to toss into the bucket. Natasha stood up and stretched her arms over her head, enjoying the summer sun. She would never tell Galyal, but summer by the beach wasn't so bad. She walked over to a giant rock that jutted over the water like a diving board. She climbed to the top of the rock and sat, letting her legs dangle over the edge and looking out at the lake. She thought about the rocks she had gathered. The brown rock would never work for making a petroglyph. It's too crumbly, and it doesn't have any flat surfaces for carving. The cream rock could work, but it's way too small. But rocks come in all different sizes, Natasha thought, patting the huge rock she was sitting on. Closing her eyes, Natasha pictured the gray stone of the cave walls where Mama worked. The rock I choose for my petroglyph doesn't have to be that color, though, Natasha thought to herself. I could choose a different color rock. It would just have to be soft enough for me to carve. Natasha remembered one time when she wanted to use a particularly pretty gray and black speckled rock in a bracelet. Even with Mama's help using a drill, she hadn't been able to make a hole in that rock. So, I want my petroglyph to be made from a smooth rock that's easy to carve, she thought. She remembered learning about different types of rocks in school, igneous, sedimentary, and metamorphic. Maybe one of those types is soft, she wondered. I can't remember why they're different, though, or how you tell them apart. The ocean wind echoed Natasha's deep sigh. What I need to do is go read about the 3 rock types, just like Galyal did. Natasha shook her head as she unfolded her legs and began walking back to Mila's house. She hated when Galyal was right. Chapter 7. Coming Together. Later that day, Galia sat, reading on the couch. The books she checked out of the library sat in an orderly row on the coffee table. The kitchen door creaked open. Natasha must be home from the beach, Galia thought. She stuck her nose further into her book, dreading asking Natasha for help. Hi, Mila said to Natasha. How was it? Good, Natasha said. I found a lot of different rocks. Natasha stepped into the living room, slowly swinging the bucket of rocks she collected. Her eyes rested on the books stacked on the coffee table. I wonder if I could look at them when Galia's gone, she thought to herself. I bet Galia already's got everything figured out. She probably made her petroglyph already. So, Galia said, closing her book, did you find a good rock for making a petroglyph? Natasha walked to the coffee table and sat down on the floor. I found a bunch of rocks, she said. How about you? I learned a lot, Galia said, but I was hoping I could see what you found too. You know, just to make sure I'm on the right track. Relief washed over Natasha and she smiled. Oh, that's a good idea. Maybe I should hear about what you learned too, just to make sure I'm on the right track. Natasha tipped her bucket onto the coffee table, pouring out a jumble of colors, shapes, and sizes. Then she reached into her pocket and set the rocks she collected for jewelry on the opposite side of the table. She pulled the brown crumbly rock out of that pile and set it in the middle of the table. Mila stood in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen. You've got quite the collection, she said. What are the piles? These are rocks I thought might work to make petroglyphs, Natasha said. These are rocks I collected to use in my jewelry. But this one? I don't know about this one. It's funny because it looks like a combination of a few different rocks and it's really crumbly. Interesting, Mila said. How did you figure out which goes in which pile? Natasha shrugged her shoulders. It was easy. Usually I want rocks for my jewelry to be small, and I look for rocks that are pretty colors or shiny. And I thought good rocks for making petroglyphs would need to be bigger and have a flat, smooth side, not like this crumbly one, she said, pointing to the rock in the middle of the table. Ah, Mila said. So, you sorted the rocks into categories based on specific characteristics or properties of the rocks. Yeah, Natasha said. I guess you could say that. You can learn a lot about a rock from its properties, Mila said. Can you think of other ways to sort the rocks? I know, Galia said. We could sort them by how they were formed. One pile for igneous rocks, one for sedimentary, and one for metamorphic. I was thinking about that when I was on the beach, Natasha said, but I couldn't remember which type was which. Galia reached for one of her books. There, she said, tapping a picture. See, the sedimentary rocks are formed when bits of other rocks are eroded. The bits settle on the bottom of the lake and are squeezed together over thousands of years. The brown rock might be that kind. That would explain why it's crumbly, Natasha said. Now you're thinking like materials engineers, Mila said. The process that creates a material affects its properties. You can see the process reflected in igneous rocks too, Galia said. They're formed when magma and lava cools. Then they're always near volcanoes, Natasha asked. Or places that used to be volcanoes, Galia replied. Or maybe in other places if the rocks were moved by the earth or river or people. Sometimes you can see grains in them when they cool slowly. She scanned the table. Maybe like that, she said, pointing to a speckled rock. And metamorphic rocks are formed when either igneous or sedimentary rocks are heated and pressed. Sometimes metamorphic rocks look stretched or folded. That happens deep in the earth when big pieces of the earth bump into each other. So, could a sedimentary rock become a metamorphic rock? Natasha asked. I think so, Galia said, if it's pushed way deep into the earth. Is that right, Mila? Right, Mila said. And how do you think that process could change the properties of the rock? Well, if this brown rock was smushed together even more and heated up, I bet it wouldn't be as crumbly. The little pieces of rock might get pushed and melted together, Natasha said. So, which properties are the most important for your petroglyph? Mila asked. I guess. Oh, well, I guess I don't know yet, said Galia. Maybe we need to look at each of these rocks and do tests to figure out which ones are the best. I bet my jewelry tools can help us do some of the tests, Natasha said. I have a carving tool that we could use to see how hard the rocks are. Mila, could you help us figure out how to do some others? You bet, Mila said. And I have another tool for you that I use in my work. It's called the engineering design process. Come help me finish making these vernicky, and I'll tell you about it. The girls went into the kitchen and began wrapping the filling Mila had made from pieces of dough. The engineering design process is a series of steps that you can use to help meet your goal, Mila explained. You've actually both already started the first step in your own different ways. Really? Galia asked. What's the first step? Asking questions. Galia, you asked questions about rocks and began to answer them by reading books. Natasha, you started answering your questions by observing and collecting rocks on the beach. And then we answered more of our questions by talking to each other, Natasha said. And we'll answer more questions when we test the rocks, Galia added. Right, Mila said. You're well on your way. After you've asked lots of questions, you'll move on to the imagine step. That's when you'll imagine different possibilities for materials that you could use to create your petroglyph. Then you can choose one idea to plan and actually create your petroglyph. I can't wait for that step, Natasha said. It is one of my favorites, Mila agreed, but sometimes the next step, improve, can be just as fun. Say you make a petroglyph, but the lines aren't as sharp as you expected. You can improve your design to make it even better. That might mean going back and asking more questions or imagining new ideas. The engineering design process is a little like the rock cycle in some ways. There's not always one clear starting point and ending point. Sometimes you have to go back and forth between some of the steps to make your design the best it can be. Chapter 8. Engineering a Solution. For the next few days, the girls asked many more questions about rocks. They tested Natasha's rocks for hardness, trying to carve into each one. On some of the rocks, they couldn't even make a mark. Others crumbled as soon as they tried to carve into them. Together, they went to the beach to collect more rocks and studied some of the petroglyphs at Mama's work site when they visited the lake. I think I'm ready for the next step, imagining, Natasha said after lunch one day. I was thinking the same thing, Galia agreed. I've already started writing down some ideas. Natasha reached into her bucket and rummaged around. I picked out a couple of rocks I could imagine using for my design, she said. She pulled out 2 rocks, then reached back in the bucket and pulled out one more. Galia's eyes widened. I was imagining using that rock too. Wow, Natasha said. We never end up choosing the same thing. I know, Galia agreed. Even though we started the engineering design process in different ways, we've gotten some of the same answers. That must be why the ideas we imagined have some things in common. So, do you want to make a plan for the rock we were both thinking of using? Natasha asked. That's okay. I'll use this one instead, Galia said, pointing to a flat, caramel-colored rock. Out of all the rocks we tested, it was the easiest to carve. Then I'll use the one we both like, Natasha said. It's harder than the rock you chose, so I'll have to carve into it a few more times to make the design, but I think it will hold up better. Galia and Natasha both drew plans for the petroglyphs, writing out the materials they would need and how many times they thought they'd need to carve into the materials they had chosen. They spent the rest of the day creating their designs. "Dinner's almost ready," Mila said, rounding the corner into the kitchen and seeing the rocks and carving tools on the table. "Am I in time to check out your first designs?" "Sure," Natasha said. "The line I carved is all ragged along the edges. Gallia's isn't like that, and I think her line came out better because she used a softer rock." "My line is smooth," Galia said, "but I think I need to carve over it a few more times so it's really clear." "Well, that's where the next step of the engineering design process comes in," Mila explained. "I think you're both on the right track. With a few small changes, I bet your designs will work out really well." Galia and Natasha both made changes to their petroglyphs and improved their processes until they had two great replicas of one of the deer carvings they'd seen at Mama's work. But they didn't stop there. Chapter 9, Old and New. The girls and Mila walked on the edge of Lake Wungo toward the cave that held some of the most amazing petroglyphs ever found. Galia stopped to look out over the lake. She watched the sunlight dance across the ripples in the water and off the spire of one of the buildings on the shore of the lake. "Come on, girls," Mila said, waving them toward the entrance of the cave. They stepped into the cave and let the cool air envelope them. As they got further into the cave, they saw small carvings of birds, deer, people, moons, and suns dotting the walls. They turned a corner and found Mama bent over her notebook. She looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. "Hi," Mama said. "I didn't expect to see you here." "We have something special to show you," Natasha said. "Our very own petroglyphs." She pulled two petroglyph designs out of her bag and showed them to Mama. "After we made the replicas of the deer petroglyphs, we used the same process to make two new petroglyphs to remind us of our summer here," Galia said. Mama smiled and put on her glasses to inspect the petroglyphs. One petroglyph showed a beach and a lake, and the other showed a street with a row of buildings. "They're wonderful," she said. "This one must be Natasha's," Mama said, pointing to the beach scene. "And this one must be Galia's," she pointed to the other. The girls smiled at each other. "Nope," Galia said. "It's the other way around. After Natasha took me to the beach, I decided to carve a picture of it on my petroglyph. And after I went into town with Galia, I decided to draw a picture of the main street," Natasha said. "So now we can remember our summer," Galia said. "That's such a good idea," Mama said. "The petroglyphs that I study represent different objects and places too. I like to think the images were important to the people who made them, just like the images on your petroglyphs are important to both of you. How did you make these?" "We thought about it like materials engineers, and we helped each other," Galia said. "We did lots of research about rocks and their properties," Natasha said. "And then we did tests to figure out which materials would work best," Galia added. "We worked together," Natasha said. "I'm proud of you both," Mama said. "Let's celebrate. Who wants to go for ice cream?" "I want chocolate," Galia said. Natasha grinned. "Really? I was thinking vanilla." The end.